August 9, 1945, 11 o'clock 2 minutes in the morning, above the city of Nagasaki, Japan. Major Charles Sweeney, 35 years old, pilot of the B-29 boxcar bomber, looked through the cockpit viewfinder at the city stretching 15,000 feet below, partially obscured by scattered clouds that made visual identification of the primary target impossible. His hands, steady on the controls despite not having had adequate sleep in 48 hours, guided the aircraft loaded with Fat Man, a 5-ton plutonium bomb that represented years of scientific work and billions of dollars in American investment focused on a single device of mass death. 3 days earlier, another crew had dropped Little Boy over Hiroshima, creating a fireball that instantly vaporized 80,000 human beings and transformed a vibrant city of 350,000 inhabitants into square miles of absolute destruction where nothing organic survived within a mile radius of the hypocenter. Sweeney had not participated in that mission, but he had seen the reconnaissance photographs that arrived 12 hours after the explosion, images that showed where a complex metropolis had once existed, now remained only ash, charred rubble, and permanent silhouettes of vaporized human beings burned into concrete walls by the luminous intensity of the detonation. What Major Sweeney did not know, what none of the 12 men aboard the boxcar that day could imagine as they carried out their technical procedures with trained professional precision, was that the decision to drop those atomic bombs had been made not in the military planning rooms of the Pentagon, where experienced generals plotted strategies based on tactical necessity, not in the strategic offices of Pacific Command where admirals calculated the costs of invading and saving American lives, but in political meetings held in Washington, where the highest-ranking American officials they debated not how to defeat Japan more efficiently, but how to impress and intimidate Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union in the geopolitical game that was already being played before World War II even officially ended. Sweeney was an ordinary man made extraordinary by the circumstances of war, a son of Boston, Massachusetts, born into a middle-class family where his father worked as a public school history teacher and his mother served as a nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital. He had graduated from Boston University in 1934 with a degree in mechanical engineering that he never used professionally because the Great Depression had made jobs scarce across America, and the Army Air Force offered financial stability, a sense of purpose, and the opportunity to fly sophisticated aircraft that fascinated his technically inclined mind. He had flown 56 combat missions in the previous 3 years, survived Japanese Zero fighters that attempted to shoot him down over the Pacific, weathered storms of anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with deadly metal fragments, navigated through devastating tropical storms that shook massive bombers like toys, and carried the accumulated psychological stress of 3 years of war, where each mission could be his last. His wife Frances was at home in Quincy, with their 2 young children, James aged 3 and Catherine aged just 18 months, children he had not seen in person for 14 months, because rotations home were rare and the war in the Pacific consumed all available resources. Frances wrote weekly letters, detailed descriptions of Catherine's first steps, questions from James about when father would return home, photographs that arrived crumpled and stained from weeks' travel along complex military routes. Each letter ended with the same sentence written in elegant cursive: "Come home soon. The boys need their father." Sweeney kept these letters in his flight pocket, folded into neat squares that he could touch during moments of extreme tension, tangible reminders of why he was doing what he did. He was a soldier who followed orders without question, a pilot who implicitly trusted his chain of command, an American who fundamentally believed his mission was necessary to save American lives and end a brutal war that had claimed 400,000 American lives in 3.5 years and completely devastated the Pacific, transforming island paradises into hellish battlefields. At that moment, as Navigator Captain James Van Pelt, 28 from Texas, confirmed the coordinates over Nagasaki after Kokura's primary target was covered by clouds that made visual bombardment impossible, Sweeney had absolutely no reason to question the official narrative that had been presented to him repeatedly through military briefings. Japan refused unconditional surrender despite imminent defeat. Invasion of the main islands would cost 1 million American lives according to official estimates. Atomic bomb was the only way to force surrender and avoid bloodshed. But the truth, meticulously preserved in declassified government documents decades later, and analyzed by generations of historians who devoted entire careers to examining every memo and telegram from that critical period, told a radically different story about the real motivations and political calculations that led to the decision to incinerate 2 Japanese cities and usher in the nuclear age. 6 months earlier, in Yalta, on the Crimean Peninsula on the shores of the Black Sea, February 12, 1945, 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a cold day where light snow fell on the Imperial Gardens, Joseph Stalin, 66 years old, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and absolute leader of a nation that had lost 27 million people in the war against Nazi Germany and sacrificed entire cities to stop the advance of the Wehrmacht, sat in an ornate room in the Levadia Palace decorated with golden tapestries and crystal chandeliers, and heard Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 63 years old and visibly weakened by progressive heart disease not publicly diagnosed but obvious to anyone who observed him closely, pleading for Soviet help against Japan, with a tone that mixed formal diplomacy with underlying urgency. 70-year-old Winston Churchill watched from the sidelines smoking his signature cigar as he mentally calculated the geopolitical implications of every word spoken, every concession offered, every promise made. Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan exactly 3 months after Germany's final defeat, a specific and calculated promise that he would fulfill with military precision, characteristic of Soviet forces, when they attacked Manchuria in August. But at that crucial moment, in that room where 3 men who controlled the destinies of hundreds of millions of people were literally redrawing the post-war world by drawing lines on maps and making agreements that would determine the geopolitical structure of the coming decades, the seed was being planted of a rivalry that would completely define the second half of the 20th century, and that would make Hiroshima and Nagasaki not acts of military necessity designed to end war more efficiently, but brutally calculated political demonstrations of American power designed to establish absolute nuclear dominance in the post-war world, before that the Soviet Union could consolidate its own imperial ambitions. Major General Leslie Groves, 48 years old, military director of the Manhattan Project and a man who controlled the American atomic program with an iron fist and obsessive paranoia about secrets, never personally participated in the Yalta negotiations, but he had understood the strategic implications of the emerging rivalry with the Soviet Union months before diplomats formalized divisions that would eventually become the Iron Curtain. Groves was an Army engineer, West Point class of 1918, a man who had supervised the construction of the Pentagon before being given the historically significant task of building the atomic bomb from abstract physical theory. Fat, brutish in his interpersonal manner, pathologically obsessed with secrets and total control of information, Groves saw the atomic bomb not just as a military weapon designed to blow up enemy targets, but as a supreme geopolitical tool that would give the United States a decisive advantage in any future negotiations with the Russians. In private meetings held in a secure Pentagon office with Secretary of War Henry Stimson, 77, a distinguished Yale-educated lawyer who had served under 5 different presidents over a public career that spanned 4 decades, Groves repeatedly argued using maps and statistical projections. Mr. Secretary, this weapon will give us a decisive advantage not only against Japan, which is already militarily defeated, but in any future negotiations with the Russians who are rapidly expanding their sphere of influence across Eastern Europe. Stimson, an educated man from the American establishment who had spent his entire public life believing in civilized diplomacy, international law, and ethical behavior between nations even during conflict, initially resisted this purely cynical view of atomic power. He had dedicated decades to building an international order based on rules, not brute force or nuclear intimidation. But as the war progressed relentlessly, and military intelligence reports about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe multiplied daily, revealing that Stalin had no intention of allowing genuine democracies in territories liberated by the Red Army, Stimson began to gradually change his mind about how the bomb should be used. In his personal diary, an entry dated April 30th, 1945, written just 2 days before Hitler committed suicide in a Berlin bunker as Soviet artillery shelled the streets above, Stimson wrote in shaky handwriting that reflected his advanced age. The bomb, as an implicitly shared secret between the United States and Great Britain, may serve to adjust relations with Russia in the post-war world. Significantly, he did not mention Japan throughout the entry. He did not discuss the military need to use bombs against Japanese targets. It did not analyze how many American lives could be saved by avoiding invasion. He spoke exclusively about Russia, Stalin, the post-war balance of power, how a nuclear weapon could be used as a diplomatic negotiating card. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Japanese government was deeply fractured and increasingly desperate as the military situation deteriorated beyond any realistic hope of victory. Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, 77 years old, Prime Minister since April 1945, when he was appointed specifically because he was perceived as a moderate who could eventually negotiate an end to the war, presided over a cabinet divided irreconcilably between hardline military factions who literally wanted to fight until the last Japanese soldier died in defense of the main islands, and royalist diplomats who recognized defeat as inevitable and desperately sought terms of surrender that would preserve something of the imperial structure. Suzuki was an extraordinarily complex man, a decorated veteran of the Russo-Japanese War of 1944 and 1935, when Japan surprised the world by defeating a European power, a survivor of a brutal assassination attempt during a military coup in 1936, when young rebel officers broke into his residence and shot him 3 times at close range, but failed to kill him because his wife courageously begged for his life. He had seen Japan transform dramatically from an isolated feudal nation into a modern imperial power, had witnessed military victories that seemed to confirm Japan's special divine destiny and superiority of the Japanese spirit, and was now watching the total and utter collapse of that imperial vision as cities were incinerated by bombing. The Navy was at the bottom of the ocean. The Air Force had been destroyed, and the American naval blockade was literally starving the civilian population to death. In May 1945, 3 full months before Hiroshima, and 4 months before the final surrender, Suzuki began secret diplomatic communications with Moscow through Ambassador Naotake Sato, 64 years old, an experienced diplomat who had served in multiple European capitals and fully understood the realities of international power. The Japanese strategic plan was superficially simple, but politically complicated. To use the Soviet Union, still technically neutral in the Pacific conflict due to a non-aggression pact signed in 1941, as an intermediary to negotiate acceptable terms of surrender that would preserve the sacred imperial institution and avoid total military occupation and complete humiliation. Sato sent multiple urgent telegrams between May and July, each message carefully coded but routinely intercepted and quickly decoded by American intelligence through the MAGIC program, a sophisticated code-breaking system that had allowed the United States to read Japanese diplomatic communications throughout the war, and which provided an incalculable intelligence advantage. Secretary of State James Burns, 46 years old, an ambitious South Carolina politician who had replaced Edward Stettinius just days after Roosevelt's sudden death in April, and who had presidential aspirations of his own that influenced his political decisions, read these intercepted telegrams daily in his secure office at the State Department. He knew with absolute certainty that Japan was actively seeking surrender through diplomatic channels. He knew that the only real unresolved issue was the emperor's status and whether the imperial institution would be preserved or destroyed. But Burns, like Groves and the growing faction within the Truman administration that saw the world through the lens of rivalry with the Soviet Union, saw the atomic bomb not as a technically efficient means of forcing Japan's surrender, which was already being negotiated, but as a dramatic means of effectively demonstrating overwhelming American power to Stalin before the Soviet Union could go to war against Japan and claim a legitimate voice in the post-war reorganization of East Asia. At a critical meeting on June 15, 1945, held in a secure conference room at the Pentagon, with maps covering the walls showing deployments of military forces across the Pacific, General George Marshall, 64 years old, Chief of Staff of the Army and probably the most respected man in the American military, due to his demonstrated competence and unquestionable personal integrity, presented a detailed analysis of the estimated cost of invading Japan's main islands using statistics from recent battles. Operation Olympic, meticulously planned for November 1945, would specifically target the southern island of Kyushu, establishing bases for a final assault. Operation Coronet, tentatively scheduled for March 1946, would be a massive amphibious assault directly on the plains near Tokyo. Marshall estimated American casualties at approximately 63,000 dead and wounded in the first 90 days of Olympic, sobering numbers based carefully on recent experience from Okinawa, where 22,000 American forces died in 82 days of extraordinarily brutal fighting. These specific and relatively modest numbers would later be dramatically inflated by factors of 4 to 5 times in public propaganda designed to justify use of the bomb, turning 63,000 casualties into 300,000, then 500,000, finally arriving at the absurd figure of 1 million American casualties that had absolutely no basis in actual military analysis or serious operational planning. But even at that crucial June meeting where fundamental decisions were being considered, several senior military officers present openly questioned the need for a ground invasion of any kind. Admiral William Leahy, 69 years old, Chief of Staff to President Truman, and a veteran of 46 years of naval service who had seen virtually every American conflict since the Spanish-American War, argued persuasively that the naval blockade had already rendered Japan completely incapable of continuing war in any meaningful way. They have no functional navy, they have no operational air force, they have no fuel to move what's left of their forces, they have no realistic way of importing food to feed the civilian population, Leahy said during the meeting using maps to illustrate the completeness of the blockade. The fundamental question is not whether they will eventually surrender, but when exactly that will happen and under what specific terms we can accept. General Curtis LeMay, 38 years old, aggressive commander of strategic bombing forces in the Pacific, and a man who had overseen a campaign of destruction of Japanese cities, completely agreed with Leahy's assessment. LeMay had personally directed a brutal firebombing campaign that had methodically destroyed 67 Japanese cities between March and July, using firebombs that created all-consuming firestorms, killed over 500,000 people through burns and asphyxiation, and left literally millions of civilians homeless living in rubble. There is virtually nothing left to bomb of significant military value, he told a meeting with the typical brutal directness that characterized his leadership style. We have already won this war decisively through air power. Surrender is just a matter of time and national pride. But 61-year-old Harry Truman, a relatively obscure former senator from Missouri, who had become president just 3 months earlier when Roosevelt died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage in Warm Springs, Georgia, faced a situation that went far beyond simply defeating Japan militarily. Truman was not a man of the established American elite who traditionally held the presidency. He had not attended prestigious Ivy League universities, did not come from a wealthy or politically connected family with generations of public service. He was the son of a farmer who struggled to survive economically. He had worked as a clothing salesman, failed in multiple businesses during the 1920s, survived brutal trench warfare in France in 1918, as an artillery captain where he saw men die in mud and poisonous gas. His political rise was a direct product of the Democratic Party machine in Kansas City, authoritatively controlled by political boss Tom Pendergast, who was eventually convicted and imprisoned for tax evasion and massive political corruption. Truman came to the presidency completely without adequate preparation to the magnitude of responsibilities, without detailed knowledge of the Manhattan Project, until days after taking office when Stimson finally revealed the existence of an atomic program, without having participated in any really important strategic decision during the war, because Roosevelt had kept the vice president completely out of military planning. Now he sat behind the historic Resolute desk in the Oval Office surrounded by men like Stimson, Burns, and Groves who had literally decades more experience in international politics and military affairs, and who all unanimously agreed on one fundamental recommendation. The atomic bomb should be used as quickly as possible, not necessarily because it was militarily necessary against Japan, which was already effectively defeated, but to deeply impress Stalin and establish absolute American dominance in the post-war world through a demonstration of unprecedented technological power. The Potsdam Conference formally began on July 17, 1945, in a Berlin suburb devastated by months of Soviet bombing and brutal house-to-house urban combat. Truman met Stalin in person for the first time at a formal reception, where leaders greeted each other through interpreters, and was deeply impressed by the Soviet leader's commanding physical presence, by the absolute confidence that emanated from a man who had commanded an army that had literally crushed the Wehrmacht across thousands of miles of hostile territory and planted a red Soviet flag atop the Reichstag in Berlin. On that same significant day, July 17th, Truman received an urgent coded telegram from New Mexico, sent by Groves using deliberately vague language. Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. It was military code for the first successful test of the Trinity atomic device in the desert near Alamogordo, an explosion that had created mushroom fire visible 200 miles away, completely vaporized a 100-foot-high steel test tower, and turned desert sand into radioactive green glass through heat that exceeded the surface temperature of the sun. Truman immediately and dramatically changed his negotiating stance with Stalin after receiving confirmation that the bomb worked. Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace, 56, former vice president under Roosevelt and one of the few truly senior members of the administration who was philosophically opposed to the use of the atomic bomb against civilian targets, was in Washington during the conference but received regular reports on negotiating dynamics through State Department channels. He wrote in his personal diary with obvious frustration, "Truman is parading himself like a kid with a dangerous new toy, using the implied threat of atomic power to intimidate Russians at every negotiating session." On July 24th, Truman deliberately but casually mentioned to Stalin that the United States had developed a new weapon of extraordinarily unusual destructive power, without providing specific technical details. Stalin, who already knew substantial details about the atomic bomb through an extensive Soviet spy network, including Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist working directly at Los Alamos who regularly transmitted atomic secrets to Moscow, simply nodded slightly and said diplomatically that he hoped Americans would make good use of it against enemies. But Stalin internally knew exactly what was happening and what the geopolitical implications were. He immediately accelerated the Soviet atomic program by ordering unlimited resources to be devoted to bomb development of his own, and began detailed military planning for rapid entry into the war against Japan, absolutely determined to establish a significant Soviet military presence in East Asia before America could consolidate victory alone and fully dominate the region's post-war reorganization. As politicians and generals negotiated the fates of nations in Potsdam, scientists who had actually built the atomic bomb through years of intense theoretical and experimental work began to have deep moral doubts about how their creation was being politicized. Leo Szilard, 47 years old, a brilliant Hungarian physicist who had fled Nazi persecution in Europe and whose initial theoretical concept of a sustained nuclear chain reaction had been absolutely fundamental in making the atomic bomb possible, circulated an urgent petition in July among scientists working in a Chicago laboratory, formally asking that the bomb not be used against Japan without a clear prior technical demonstration and an explicit opportunity for the Japanese government to surrender under reasonable terms. Obles, 70 scientists with impeccable credentials signed a petition that argued for moral and political reasons that the use of an atomic weapon against the civilian population would set a dangerous precedent and start a global nuclear arms race. The carefully crafted petition never came remotely close to Truman or even Stimson. Groves, obsessed with maintaining absolute control over all aspects of the atomic program and deeply suspicious of scientists he saw as naive idealists with no understanding of the realities of power, intercepted the document and simply filed it away in a secure vault where it remained classified for decades. J. Robert Oppenheimer, 41 years old, charismatic scientific director of Los Alamos and brilliant mind behind the elegant technical design of the atomic bomb, had much more ambivalent and psychologically complex reactions to the imminent use of his creation. Oppenheimer was a professor of theoretical physics at Berkeley, a former communist sympathizer during the 30s, when that ideology attracted many intellectuals concerned about the Depression and fascism. A man of complicated loyalties and a deeply tormented philosophical conscience who cited Sanskrit literature and English poetry as easily as he discussed nuclear physics. He had personally overseen the construction and operation of a completely isolated secret science city in the New Mexico desert, where 5,000 people, including some of the world's most brilliant physicists, worked 24 hours a day for 3 intense years to transform abstract theory into working physical reality. When the first atomic bomb exploded dramatically at the Trinity test in Alamogordo, creating light brighter than 1,000 suns and mushrooming into the stratosphere, Oppenheimer immediately quoted a verse from the Bhagavad Gita, the sacred Hindu text he had studied in the original Sanskrit. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It was recognition of the magnitude of what scientists had created, a weapon that could literally destroy human civilization. But despite this deep philosophical understanding, Oppenheimer did not formally oppose the immediate military use of the bomb against Japanese cities. Like many scientists involved in the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer had convinced himself through psychological rationalization that a shocking demonstration of absolute destructive power would shorten the war significantly, and therefore save both American and Japanese lives compared to the alternative of a prolonged invasion. What he did not adequately consider, or chose not to consider for reasons he himself would question for the rest of his life, was that dramatic demonstration did not necessarily need to be made in a densely populated city full of innocent civilians, that Japan was already actively seeking surrender through diplomatic channels, that the real bomb targets in Truman and Burns's political calculation were not Japanese military personnel, but Soviet leaders sitting in Moscow's Kremlin, observing the redistribution of global power. The Interim Committee, a select group formed specifically to advise Truman on the appropriate use of the atomic bomb, met for the last decisive time on June 1, 1945, in a secure conference room in Washington. Present was James Conant, 52 years old, respected president of Harvard University and distinguished chemist who had worked extensively on chemical weapons development during World War I, and therefore had direct experience with the moral dilemmas of military science. Also present was Vannevar Bush, 55 years old, an influential engineer who efficiently coordinated all American military scientific research through the Office of Scientific Research and Development, and Arthur Compton, 53, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who ran the crucial metallurgical laboratory in Chicago, where much of the fundamental work on chain reactions had been carried out. These highly educated and morally conscious men carefully discussed 4 distinct options for use of the atomic bomb. First, purely scientific technical demonstration on a remote desert island, with Japanese observers invited to witness the weapon's power without causing casualties. Second, military demonstration on a purely Japanese military target such as a naval base or isolated industrial facility minimizing civilian casualties. Third, direct use in a densely populated urban area without any prior warning maximizing shock and terror. Fourth, decision not to use bomb in any way, but simply to keep it as a diplomatic threat. After a debate that lasted hours and considered moral, military, and political implications, they unanimously voted for option 3, direct use against the urban civilian population without warning. Official reasoning recorded in classified minutes. Technical demonstration on a desert island could fail, cynically embarrassing the United States. A purely military target would not be sufficiently impressive visually or psychologically to force immediate surrender. Only total and utter urban destruction would adequately communicate the weapon's real revolutionary power to Japanese and world leaders. But declassified internal government documents decades later reveal a much more frank and cynically political discussion that took place in that room. Burns argued explicitly using careful diplomatic language that Stalin needed to see complete devastation in person through photographs and intelligence reports, and that maximum psychological impact on Russian leaders would be achieved only with absolutely complete urban destruction that demonstrated that America possessed the power to eliminate entire cities instantly. Significantly, no one present at that crucial meeting explicitly mentioned that Japan was already actively negotiating surrender through Moscow. No one seriously discussed the specific telegram of July 22nd, in which Ambassador Sato desperately implored Tokyo to accept basic terms of the Potsdam Declaration and end war before complete destruction occurred. Focus was almost entirely on Russia, on Stalin, on post-war balance of power, on establishing American hegemony through demonstration of overwhelming technological superiority. August 2nd, 1945, 9 o'clock in the morning on a hot and humid day, airbase on Tinian, a small island in the Mariana Islands that had been transformed into the largest airbase in the world, with 6 parallel runways processing B-29 bombers constantly. Colonel Paul Tibbets, 30 years old, a highly experienced pilot personally selected by Groves to command 509 Composite Bombardment Group due to his exceptional technical skills and proven psychological stability, gave an extremely detailed final briefing to his carefully selected crew on the historic mission that would take place in just 4 days. Tibbets had named his custom B-29 Enola Gay in direct honor of his mother, Enola Gay Haggard Tibbets. A deeply sentimental decision for an aircraft that would carry a weapon that would kill 80,000 people instantly and condemn another 80,000 to slow, agonizing deaths from radiation in the months that followed. The crew consisted of 12 carefully chosen men, average age just 26, all volunteers who had been selected through extensive psychological testing, specifically designed to ensure they would follow orders without emotional questioning even under extreme stress. Captain Theodore Van Kirk, 24, a meticulous navigator from Texas who had studied engineering before the war, had flown 58 dangerous missions over Europe, including the devastating bombing of Dresden. Major Thomas Farabee, a 25-year-old exceptionally accurate bomber from North Carolina, who grew up on a farm and developed hand-eye coordination through hunting, was considered literally one of the most accurate visual bombers in all of the American Air Forces. Tibbets informed the crew in deliberately vague language that they would be carrying a special bomb with unprecedented destructive power, but did not reveal specific technical details about the weapon's atomic nature or the true magnitude of destruction it would cause. They did not know that 300 of the most brilliant scientists from America and Europe worked obsessively 3 full years to create that single device, that the total cost of the Manhattan Project had exceeded a staggering $2 billion in 1945 dollars, equivalent to approximately $28 billion in adjusted 2025 dollars. They did not know that the specific choice of Hiroshima as the primary target had been made not out of particular strategic military importance, but precisely because the city had been deliberately and systematically spared from previous conventional bombings for months specifically, so that the pure effect of the atomic bomb could be measured scientifically and documented photographically without methodological contamination from previous damage from regular bombings. Hiroshima had a civilian population of approximately 350,000 inhabitants, including tens of thousands of schoolchildren. It was not a truly significant center of military production compared to other cities. It did not host a strategically important military command for the Japanese war effort. It was simply a substantial but intact city of a physically appropriate size for a scientific experiment in urban destruction through nuclear fission. The Military Target Committee had initially seriously considered Kyoto, the former imperial capital, as an absolute target, mindfully primary. Kyoto had a population of approximately 1 million people, was the cultural capital of Japanese civilization for more than 1,000 years, the center of historic Buddhist temples, legendary Zen gardens, and irreplaceable artistic treasures. But Stimson, who had spent his romantic honeymoon in Kyoto in 1926 with his wife, and developed genuine admiration for the city's elegant temples and meticulously manicured gardens, personally and unilaterally removed Kyoto from the list of potential targets. It was not a decision based on deep humanitarian reasons or moral considerations about preserving world cultural heritage, but a cold political calculation that destruction of such a historically important and revered cultural center could create lasting and intense resentment among the Japanese population that would seriously complicate post-war American occupation and reconstruction of Japan as an ally. Hiroshima was chosen as a replacement precisely because its complete destruction would not create a significant international political problem or legacy of bitterness that would last for generations. Between August 2nd and 6th, while the Enola Gay's crew made meticulous final technical preparations and rehearsed procedures repeatedly, Urgent diplomatic messages continued to flow steadily between Tokyo and Moscow via secure telegraphic channels. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, 63 years old, an experienced and sophisticated diplomat who had served as ambassador in Berlin and Moscow and deeply understood the complexities of European politics, sent a particularly urgent telegram on August 5th, insistently asking Ambassador Sato to obtain a definitive Soviet response on the real possibility of mediation to end the war under acceptable terms. Sato, a pragmatic man who had no illusions about the realities of power, responded with brutal honesty that the Soviets were absolutely and obviously planning to go to war with Japan very soon, and that Japan must surrender immediately and unconditionally without further delay before the situation became completely impossible. Togo, caught between military reality and internal politics, did not share this pessimistic but realistic assessment with the Supreme War Council, a restricted body of 6 most powerful men who made all final war decisions, precisely because hardline military ministers would have absolutely rejected any discussion of unconditional surrender. Paralyzing political impasse continued. Diplomats like Togo desperately wanted surrender that minimally preserved the imperial institution and system of government. Military hardliners like Minister of War Anami preferred the literal total physical destruction of the nation to admitting humiliating defeat to Western powers. August 6, 1945, 2 hours and 45 minutes in the still dark morning, Enola Gay took off smoothly from the runway on Tinian, carefully carrying Little Boy, a relatively simple uranium bomb with explosive power equivalent to approximately 16,000 tons of conventional TNT, concentrated in a 3-meter-long device. Flight across the Pacific lasted 6 tedious hours. Crew ate corned beef sandwiches, played cards to pass the time, chatted casually about post-war plans, and what they would do when they finally returned home after the war inevitably ended. Atmosphere was strangely relaxed given the historic magnitude of what they were about to do. At 8:15 minutes in the morning, Farabee released a bomb precisely from an altitude of 31,600 feet on a visual aiming point identified as the Aioi Bridge, characteristic in the geographic center of Hiroshima. Bomb fell freely through the air for exactly 43 seconds before explosively detonating at 1,890 feet altitude, specific height carefully calculated by physicists to mathematically maximize radius of destruction through reflected shockwave optimization. Nuclear explosion instantly created fireball with core temperature exceeding millions of degrees Celsius, devastating wind propagating at over 700 miles per hour, and sudden atmospheric pressure that literally obliterated everything within a mile radius, turning solid buildings into dust. 80,000 people died absolutely instantly, completely vaporized by heat or fatally crushed by pressure before their brains could process that anything had happened. Another 70,000 approximately died agonizingly over the following months from horrific 3rd and 4th degree thermal burns, acute radiation poisoning that destroyed cellular systems, massive traumatic injuries from flying debris res and collapse of structures. Traditional wood and paper structure of Japanese houses meant that secondary fires spread absolutely uncontrollably through the city, creating a literal firestorm that consumed everything organic. Hospitals were instantly destroyed, doctors and nurses killed at their posts, medical equipment melted into molten metal, making any organized medical response impossible. Severely injured survivors staggered bewildered through burned-out streets desperately searching for water, as skin hung in long strips from bodies. Eyes had partially melted into sockets. Hair had been burned away completely. Charred young children repeatedly called out for mothers who simply no longer existed, had been vaporized or crushed under the rubble of collapsed homes. Tibbets observed a dramatic explosion from an absolutely safe distance of 15 kilometers, saw a characteristic mushroom rise rapidly to an altitude of 18,000 meters penetrating the stratosphere, felt successive shock waves violently shake a massive aircraft even at that distance. Co-pilot Robert Lewis, 26, wrote in his personal logbook with a shaking hand, "My God, what exactly have we done?" But Tibbets personally had no significant moral doubts about mission. He followed military orders as a professional soldier, completed the technically assigned mission with exemplary precision, landed the aircraft back on Tinian 12 hours later, where he was immediately received as an absolute national hero and formally awarded the Distinguished Service Cross by General Karl Spaatz, 54 years old, commander of the Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific. No one present at that decoration ceremony explicitly mentioned that Japan had already been actively negotiating surrender for months. No one openly discussed that specific target had been chosen primarily for scientific experimental value, not tactical military necessity. Public focus was entirely on extraordinary technical success, on dramatic demonstration of American technological power, on political message sent unequivocally to Moscow about New World Order. In Washington, Truman received coded news of the mission's success as he slowly returned from Potsdam, aboard the heavy cruiser USS Augusta, in the middle of the Atlantic. He was having an informal dinner with the crew when an urgent message arrived via naval radio. Truman read the telegram quickly and announced dramatically to surrounding officials, "This is the greatest event in human history." He expressed absolutely no remorse, did not question whether 80,000 civilians killed instantly and another 70,000 sentenced to slow death were an acceptable moral price. Political considerations of power were completely and absolutely in the first place. Stalin received detailed news of the bomb through an urgent Soviet military intelligence report hours before any official American diplomatic communication. His calculated reaction was to immediately and dramatically accelerate the Soviet military entry into the war against Japan. On August 8th, just 48 hours after Hiroshima, and before any formal Japanese response could be organized, the Soviet Union formally declared war on Japan and launched a massive coordinated invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria, with an overwhelming force of 1,500,000 veteran soldiers, 5,000 modern tanks, and overwhelming air power from thousands of aircraft. It was the largest and most impressive Soviet military operation ever conducted in Asia, executed with devastating tactical precision that completely crushed the Japanese Kwantung Army in just 2 weeks of intense combat. For the Japanese government in Tokyo, Soviet entry into the war was a strategic and psychological shock, greater than an incomprehensible atomic bomb. Hiroshima was absolutely incomprehensible technological horror and profound psychological trauma, but Japan had technically survived the catastrophic firebombing of Tokyo, where the massive attack of March 9th and 10th had killed 100,000 people in a single hellish night through conventional firestorm. The Soviet Union formally entering the war meant a definitive and absolute end to any realistic hope of mediated negotiation, an irrevocable end to the possibility of preserving a territorial empire in Manchuria and Korea, a concrete and immediate threat of a Soviet invasion of Japan's main islands, with unpredictable political consequences. August 9th, 11 o'clock, 2 minutes in the morning, Major Sweeney dropped Fat Man, the second atomic bomb, on Nagasaki, creating similar destruction. Designated primary target had originally been Kokura, but dense clouds forced a last-minute change to secondary target Nagasaki. 40,000 people died instantly in this second nuclear explosion. Another 40,000 inevitably followed in the subsequent months of radiation, burns, and traumatic injuries without adequate medical treatment. Fat Man was a plutonium bomb using a completely different and more sophisticated technical design, implosion technology rather than Little Boy's simple barrel design, allowing use of plutonium rather than scarce uranium. 2 cities destroyed, 2 different technical designs tested, 2 massive scientific experiments in urban destruction with real human beings unwittingly serving as experimental guinea pigs. Sweeney almost failed to return to base, had to land in Okinawa due to a critical lack of fuel, and almost fell fatally into the ocean. No one on the crew openly questioned whether the second bomb was actually militarily necessary. No one asked why it was imperative to drop the second bomb on August 9th, when the Soviet Union had formally entered war on August 8th, changing the strategic equation completely. The real answer was in Potsdam, in growing rivalry with Stalin, in the political need to demonstrate unequivocally that America possessed multiple working atomic bombs, not just a single experimental prototype, and the industrial capacity to produce more quickly. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council met on the night of August 9th in a fortified underground bunker of the Imperial Palace, while Tokyo was still suffering from conventional nighttime bombing. Extremely heated debate continued for literally hours without resolution. Minister of War Korichika Anami, 58 years old, an absolutely hardline general who would prefer honorable death to humiliating surrender, argued passionately that Japan must absolutely continue fighting to the last man. "We have 60 million Japanese psychologically prepared to die like broken swords defending sacred ground," he said using traditional samurai rhetoric. "One or two atomic bombs do not fundamentally change the basic military equation or indomitable spirit of the Japanese people." But Suzuki, the pragmatic prime minister, and Togo, the realistic foreign minister, argued persuasively that continuation was literally national suicide that would result in the complete extinction of Japanese civilization. Paralyzing impasse was finally broken only when Emperor Hirohito, 44 years old, a traditionally divine figure who had never spoken directly in government council throughout the war per imperial protocol, intervened personally and dramatically. "The situation has grown so absolutely desperate that I must order an immediate end to hostilities to preserve what remains of the nation," Hirohito said, in a calm but firm voice that shocked everyone present. Careful historical analysis reveals that it was not Hiroshima that fundamentally decided to surrender. It wasn't Nagasaki. It was Soviet military entry, the terrible prospect of communist occupation, political fear that the 1,000-year-old imperial dynasty would be completely destroyed under Soviet rule. Japan formally surrendered on August 15th, 6 days after the second bomb, and 7 crucial days after the Soviet Union entered war, changing the political calculation completely. Final terms of surrender preserved the emperor as a symbolic figure without real political power, exactly the fundamental compromise that Japan had desperately sought through Soviet mediation months before bombs were dropped. If Truman had offered these specific terms in June or July when diplomatic negotiations were actively taking place, war could very likely have ended without unnecessary atomic bombs, without 140,000 civilians killed horribly, without initiating the nuclear arms race that defined the Cold War. But political considerations of impressing Stalin and establishing American hegemony dictated a radically different course, with consequences that resonate to this day. Decades later, when the American government finally began the declassification process, internal documents revealed the full extent of political cynicism. Confidential internal memos from Burns explicitly showed that he had instructed American diplomats to deliberately reject any serious Japanese attempt at surrender before the bomb was used publicly. "We don't want them to surrender before we demonstrate the revolutionary power of the new weapon to the world," he wrote cynically on July 3rd. Stimson's personal diary, published in part in 1947 after his retirement, included a revealing entry from July 21st. "Fundamental political purpose of using bomb is to deeply impress Russians with our superior technological capability and willingness to use it." General Dwight Eisenhower, 55 years old, senior commander the victor in Europe who would eventually become president in 1953, revealed in 1963 that he had personally advised Stimson strongly against using the atomic bomb. Japan was already completely defeated militarily, and use of the bomb was absolutely unnecessary from a military point of view, Eisenhower wrote in his published memoirs. "I deeply hated seeing our country being the first to use such an inhumane weapon against a civilian population." Admiral Leahy was even more direct and damning in his frank memoirs published in 1950. "My own professional opinion is that in using atomic bombs against civilian cities, we have adopted the ethical standard of medieval Dark Age barbarians. I was not taught in my naval education to wage war in this inhumane manner, and just wars cannot be won morally by indiscriminately destroying innocent women and defenseless children." But these dissenting voices from respected officers were systematically silenced at the time by immediate political necessity and intensive propaganda from the emerging Cold War. Simplified official narrative essentially became unquestionable law. Bombs magically saved 1 million American lives through completely invented statistics, forced Japanese surrender that was not coming by other means, were tragically necessary to end war quickly. Any serious questioning of this narrative was routinely labeled as unpatriotic, as implicit condonation for well-documented Japanese atrocities, as dangerous naivete about the brutal nature of total war. But hard numbers simply didn't support the official propaganda narrative. Detailed contemporary military analyses realistically predicted 63,000 American casualties, not the mythical number of 1 million fabricated later. Japan had been actively negotiating surrender for months through multiple channels, not preparing fanatical final resistance. Bombs did not technically force surrender. Soviet entry, which changed political calculation, did. And the dominant real purpose was unmistakably political, directed at Moscow, not military, directed at Tokyo. This fundamental truth about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, preserved in official documents but often ignored in popular patriotic narrative, remains one of the most disturbing and important historical lessons about how political power really operates and how individual human lives are easily sacrificed for strategic geopolitical goals that have very little to do with morally elevated public justifications presented for public consumption and historical legitimation.